Hi YouTube, it's Kathy, and this is my weekly entertainment wrap-up for May 2nd through 8th. This week I read 3 books, I watched 4 shows, and I listened to 1 book. First we have Catfishing on Catnet, which is a book that I saw over on the Literature Science Alliance originally, so thank you very much for the recommendation, Angela. This book is a mixture of a couple of different things. On the one hand, we start off on the very first chapter with a character we know is an artificial intelligence who has created this thing called Catnet. On the other hand, we have this other protagonist named Steph who has been constantly on the run. For as long as she can remember, her and her mom have been on their own and they move house constantly, and she knows it's because her dad is a dangerous dude. Her only real ties to any form of friendship are on this website called Catnet. She's not allowed to upload a photograph of what she looks like, but she is allowed to talk to people in her Clowder. Since the threat of her dad finding her and her mother is very high, when something shows up one day to her address, when it really shouldn't because nobody knows her address, she starts to panic a little bit. However, it's something that's helpful that she actually needs for a project that she was going to pull off at her school, so she figures it had to be somebody from the Clowder, but how would they possibly know where she lives? For the first time in ages, she finds herself in a place she really wants to stay, even though the school is kind of crap because the people there are pretty okay. What follows would actually make a pretty decent action movie, so, you know, Netflix, if you're listening to me, look into this one. My one complaint about this is the title is a little bit misleading. There wasn't anybody on the Clowder catfishing people, because that implies some form of malicious intent, and that wasn't the case. Sure, nobody knew that this online site was created by a sentient AI, but that's a different story, and that definitely comes into play in the story. Next, I picked up a graphic novel solely because it was written by Marij Nikamp, and I had read 2 of their books last month, and that is The Oracle Code. Upon opening this graphic novel, I realized that it's all based around Barbara Gordon. I knew that the protagonist was going to be in a wheelchair because that's quite evident on the cover, but I didn't know that the protagonist was Commissioner Gordon's daughter. Barbara is doing some hacking one night on the rooftop with her best friend Benjamin when she realizes that there is a crime in progress, and in the course of that crime she ends up in a wheelchair. After about 6 weeks in the hospital, her father has taken her to this house basically that is there to teach people who have newly acquired disabilities how to get through life. At this point she doesn't want to be there and she's distraught. She hasn't heard from her best friend, he hasn't come to see her since the accident happened, and she's really scared about putting herself out there with these other people because what if they leave her too? This leads to a bit of a mystery which she has to solve. This was fun. It was interesting to have a story set in Gotham City that didn't have Batman in it whatsoever. Next, I finished Geek Elders Speak in Our Own Voices. This is a compilation of 20 women who have been elders in the geekish society, and their fandoms go back to as early as I want to say about the 40s. And this is a collection of their first-hand accounts of their fanish lives. Kathy from editing here. I forgot to point out that this was actually a collection that is based on a panel that was at Geek Girl Con in 2014, and I actually attended that panel, so it was cool to read this book. There is a lot of really interesting content in here and just overlaps between these women's lives, whether or not they went to the same conferences or they had the same fandoms or they did the same kind of activities like making fanzines. However, if you're reading these essays back to back to back, they do get a little bit repetitive, and I feel like the editing on this collection could have been a little bit stronger, just so asides like, and that's before the internet existed, although important to the context of every essay, it doesn't need to be there if it's in a collection of essays about the same thing. I don't know what the assignment was when these women were writing these essays, but it feels like they were just told to write everything about their fanish lives, and I felt that they could have honed in on specific things so there wasn't so much repetition throughout the collection. That being said, I did learn some things. This was an important piece of history, and I enjoyed it. On to what I watched this week. We continued watching Bones, and a major character death occurred, so we weren't looking forward to that, and that happened, and it was sad, and we hated it. Now at this point, the only thing that I know for sure happens is one of the main characters gets injured, and that's a whole big plot point, and I don't really remember how that resolves. Not that the injury goes away, because I'm quite sure it doesn't, but it changes a bit of that person's personality. I want to be able to watch and kind of try to figure out what kind of representation it is. It might not even be something that I can personally figure out because I've never been in that circumstance, but I'm looking forward to seeing how that subplot is handled. We also continued with Malcolm in the Middle, and there were a whole host of episodes I'm pretty sure I've never seen before, so it's fun. I believe we're on the 5th season, and I believe there are 7 seasons, so we'll see how that goes. This week my best friend pointed out to me that Curiosity Stream is a thing, so I watched an entire 8-part series called Scotland's Murder Mysteries. This was fun because I got to listen to the accents, I got all of this history, I got to see all of these places that I've been before or places that I'm missing. And then of course we got to learn about 7 murders and one guy who wasn't a murderer, so I'm not entirely sure why he was on this list, but that was actually the only story that I'd heard before because I used to be a tour guide in Scotland. What up, birds? Really? This is the type of show that has like dramatic reenactments of these old-timey people and what they would have been doing at the time, and then professionals talking about the case. And I really enjoyed it, actually. I think I'm going to be watching a lot more documentary style stuff as the weeks progress. I of course also watched this week's episode of Drag Race Down Under. This was only the 2nd episode, and now we're down to 8 contestants at the end of it. This is also the earliest that a season of RuPaul's Drag Race has had Snatch Game because it was the 2nd episode. There were definitely some great moments in there. There was definitely some womp moments in there, and I didn't expect the person who went home to go home so early in this competition, and clearly she didn't either. And I don't think I've seen somebody leave the competition in quite those spirits. So yeah, we'll see how the rest of the series goes. The book I listened to this week was What Big Teeth. I didn't really know anything about this one going into it besides the cover, and I assumed there would be some reference to Little Red Riding Hood, and that did happen in this. At the start of this book, the protagonist is on a train on her way home, and she hasn't been home from boarding school in 8 years. At this point, because there was a prologue, we have an idea of why she was sent away, but as you see more about her family, you really don't understand why she particularly was sent to boarding school when she has an older sister and a cousin who live at the family house. It turns out that everyone in her family is a little bit odd. Her grandfather, her father, and her cousin and her sister are all werewolves. Her grandmother has some magical powers. Her aunt is just odd. We don't really know what her powers are, but she's just kind of silent and is the servant for the family. Her mother has some form of deformity that means that it's best if she's kept wet, so she spends a lot of time just hanging out in bathtubs. And then there's this mysterious family friend named Arthur who's just always kind of around, and he's kind of the accountant, but also kind of the family friend. We know from the get-go that the protagonist doesn't have these wolf-shifting powers that some of her family seems to have, and she seems kind of like the black sheep of the family. And this story takes quite a while to really get going. I did want to point out that the audiobook narrator of this one is Jessica Nicole, who I know from the Welcome to Night Vale universe, and she did a really good job. There was one character that shows up at one point that has a French accent, and she was able to carry that off pretty well in my opinion. And honestly, it was just good to hear her voice again because I haven't listened to that podcast in way too long. What I didn't really care for is this had a really slow pace for most of it, and I didn't really understand some of the things the protagonist was doing. But once we got to like the last 20% of the book, I've suddenly started to get really into it because little things were clicking into place. However, because so much of the first 80% has to do with her sister possibly dating the Arthur character, who we have no idea how old this guy is, but we know he was old enough to teach her piano when she was a child, and he just seems to have never aged. And the fact that her cousin also seems to be in love with Arthur, and her dad is sort of weird about Arthur, and she is starting to get feelings about Arthur, that was all a little bit weird. That part is eventually kind of explained away, and it took the protagonist way too long to figure out that something was going weird there. I would recommend this for the atmosphere, and if you really like slow burn plots that eventually ramp up to something really interesting at the end. But I'm not going to lie, I found this a slog for quite a bit of it. That's it for this week. If you've read, watched, or listened to any of these, let me know about it down in the comments below. On the way down to the comments, if you hit that subscribe button, that would be very nice of you. If you don't feel like leaving a comment but want to make sure that I know you were here, just leave me an emoji or a smiley face if you're on your keyboard. Some people have asked if there's a way to financially support this channel, so I set up a Ko-fi account, which is a digital tipping service. The link for that is down below, as well as the link to my PayPal and my Amazon wishlist in case you would like to buy me a book. You can like and share this as you see fit, and I will see you very soon. Bye!